We're very lucky to have as our featured speaker Dr. Anjan Chakravarty. He grew up in Canada. He has his bachelor's in biophysics and a master's in philosophy from the University of Toronto, and then from the University of Cambridge. He has a master's in philosophy from that, as well as a PhD. More recently, a grant was made to the University of Miami for a chair, and a chair in university parlance means an endowed position for which there are specific funds, usually for a kind of specific purpose, a chair for the study of atheism, humanism, and secular ethics. So we're very, very pleased to have him speak to us. He's very thoughtful, and I believe you're going to enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, so let's return to thinking about some of the different ways in which science and values are inevitably entangled. So earlier I talked about directions of scientific research, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about scientific methods of investigation. One very obvious way in which values inevitably infiltrate our methods concerns ethical values. So especially when it comes to studying things that are alive, or studying things in ways that may affect living things or the environment. For example, should we use animals in research? If so, then should we use them always for anything? Or should there be certain circumstances under which we think it's a good idea and other circumstances under which we think it might just be frivolous? What about research that involves human subjects? Today, in most places, we have ethical review boards that have to approve research plans whenever they involve human beings. But that wasn't always the case, right? There are amazing historical examples of work that, from our current ethical perspective, might be uncomfortable for us to think about now, or that we might find troubling. Here's a nice example, which I'm sure many of you have come across at some point. The Milgram experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s at Yale. Not surprisingly, after the Second World War and the horrors of the Nazi state and the Nazi science infrastructure, there was a lot of interest in better understanding how people respond to authority when it clashes with their personal conscience. In the Milgram experiments, volunteers were solicited to help do the science, but what they didn't know was that actually they weren't just helping to run the experiment. In fact, they were the subjects of the experiment, right? So already here you have something that would probably be a violation, would be a violation of what's allowed today. So here's the basic idea of the experiment. The volunteers were told that they were helping to run an experiment on how people learn things. Actually, it was an experiment on what lengths people will go to doing unethical things if they're told to do them by an authority figure. So the volunteer was shown a learner restrained and hooked up to what looked like electrodes. And then the volunteer was taken into a different room where he could still communicate with the learner, and from which he could give the learner a test, right? So the test was a memory test. The volunteer would read pairs of words to the learner and then ask him to repeat them. If the learner got something wrong, the volunteer was told by an authority figure, right? Perhaps someone in a lab coat with a clipboard, right? Looking seriously scientific, to push a button that would give the learner an electric shock. And for every wrong answer, the voltage would go up. Now, as it happens, there was no learner and there were no shocks, right? The learner was an actor, the shocks were pretend, but the volunteers didn't know this. So the whole setup was just to see how far someone would go in what they believed was actually causing pain to someone else when this was sanctioned by somebody in a position of authority. They had taped sounds that they would use so that when a pretend shock was given, the learner would sound like he was banging on the wall or crying out in pain or begging for mercy. And then at some point, when the shocks continued, they would just stop making sounds at all. In the first experiments that Milgram did, 65% of people were willing to go all the way up to the maximum voltage, 450 volts. Everyone was willing to go up to 300 volts. As you can imagine, they were tortured by this, right? So they showed all kinds of signs of nervousness and ultimately emotional stress, in some cases quite severe. This is now a classic example of a research methodology that one might argue was probably ethically compromised. She describes a case in which values are, she argues, a required part of scientific reasoning itself. They aren't something that you could strip out, even if you wanted to. Sometimes values are required even to know how to read and interpret the data of scientific work. As you know, we have a scary history of toxic byproducts from manufacturing and other factory processes being released into the environment, where they've done immense harm. Dioxins are one example of this. They're produced in various ways. They're produced in making herbicides, in pulp and paper, like bleaching paper, and so on. At a certain point, worries started to arise about the possible effects on human health of the release of this chemical waste product into lands where they were contaminating the water and building up in sources of food like dairy, meat, and fish. And as we know now, dioxins actually cause all kinds of very serious problems in humans, including cancers. But to know these things, we had to investigate. What they did was expose rats to varying levels of dioxin, and then they performed autopsies to see what effect this had. In the first long-term study, this was published in 1978, they focused on liver cancer. And to make a long story short, here's the challenge. When examining the slides that were prepared from liver biopsies, some were clearly cancerous, some were clearly not, and then there were a bunch that were in between, right, where it wasn't entirely clear how they should be classified. In fact, it could be a very tough call to make, and even experts could disagree. In fact, they did disagree. So how do you classify the data? If you're very strict one way and classify anything that's unclear, right, in that nebulous zone as cancerous, then you run the risk of false positives. That is, the risk of counting something as cancerous when actually it isn't. On the other hand, if you're very strict the other way and classify anything that's unclear as not cancerous, well, then you run the opposite risk, right? The risk of false negatives. That is, counting genuinely cancerous, not counting genuinely cancerous slides. How do we strike the balance in these sorts of cases? On reflection, right, when you think about how best to do that, values inevitably play a role. I mean, what are we most concerned about? If we err on the side of caution, we're more likely to protect human health, but maybe at the cost of the profitability of manufacturers who will now have to pay more to reduce environmental pollution. If we err on the side of being less cautious, well, then it's more likely that manufacturers will be more profitable and perhaps they'll be able to hire greater numbers of people and support the kind of economic development that really helps a community, maybe at the cost of human health. Sometimes values are central to how we actually do science, how we do things like read and interpret scientific evidence.
Carrie?
How can we make sure that the work is done thoroughly and accurately? Is there an opportunity for review? So the question is, how do we get more thoughtful evaluation and correction?
Well, I think, there's good news and bad news, and hopefully over time the good news trumps the bad news. One of the challenges that you've just pointed out is just a fact of life, and there's no getting around it. And that is that when it comes to working out what the facts of the matter are in any particular area of inquiry, and you've been involved in several, so you know, the conclusions we reach outstrip our data. I mean, we have data, but then we need to make a leap from that data. When people are claiming that they've detected the latest subatomic particle at CERN in Geneva, it's not because they've seen the particle, it's because they have a lot of very complicated data, right? Computer models and so on and so forth, from which they infer that they've been successful in detecting a particle. You always have to make a leap from your data to draw whatever conclusion you're drawing. And that leap may carry more or less risk. And that is just a fact of life, and there's no way of getting around it. On the other hand, so that's the bad news, that's just our human condition. I mean, that's just, something we have to face up to. On the other hand, I think some of the strategies are the kinds of strategies that we use to try to mitigate the risk associated when we take leaps from the data. And sometimes it just takes time because it's hard to think of all of the ways in which we might be wrong, especially at the early stage of inquiry. So I think, we really need to think about scientific inquiry in a diachronic kind of light. When we start to look in a particular area, the science is inevitably going to be relatively unsettled, and there are going to be lots of things we haven't thought of. And over time, in part because scientists like to argue with each other so much, a lot of the confounding factors and other possibilities will come to light, and we can't do anything except investigate them. I think there's a balance to be struck. As scientists, and you will know this, you can't just roll over every time someone says, well, I can explain your data differently. If we always rolled over, we'd never make any progress. We need to give a hypothesis a chance to survive in the face of all the investigation we're doing. On the other hand, we can't be dogmatic. If we find ourselves going to such lengths that our explanations now, right, just so we can hold on to our pet theory, are becoming more and more ridiculous, well, then we know that it's time, to switch teams. So this is a diachronic process. It isn't something that is fixed. It's something that develops over time. And if we employ some of the strategies that I suggested we should make sure are part of our scientific endeavor to Sandeep, then we stand the best chance of doing that over time.
Let me see if I have any in the queue here. What's going on with COVID-19? And science is not geared to coming through typically with fast answers for these type of things.
I think this is a diachronic process. And so people want fast answers right away, and fast answers can always be given, but they're always given then in a context of very high uncertainty. And one of the things we're doing is we're always trying to boost the probability that whatever provisional hypothesis we have or theory we come up with is true. And it's just a fact that at the very beginning, when there are so many possibly confounding factors, like in the case of a new virus and a new disease and what might be mitigating treatments, the uncertainty is high. It just is high. And answers can always be given, but they're always just the best answers we can give at that time. And the level of uncertainty will diminish in time, but it may not be fast enough for our liking. In this case, it's certainly not fast enough for our liking. People do the best they can with the information they have. Hydroxychloroquine, was there ever a good reason for thinking that it might work? Not really. So then immediately you would assign a low probability to that hypothesis. Then some people report that actually, I think it's working. That's anecdotal evidence. It's not particularly high up on the chain of the rankings of most powerful evidence ever, but it's something. And in a time of high uncertainty, it might take on some value. So then you've got some mitigating data. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And this is a case where experts may not always disagree, but as citizens who are not experts, we're really reliant on expert judgment. And in cases where fast answers are needed, I think the best thing we can do is rely on the preponderance of expert judgment, even understanding that it's in a context of high uncertainty and they may change their minds. Thank you for joining in tonight.